The fluorescent lights of Metro City Indoor Range hummed overhead as Sarah Mitchell adjusted her safety glasses and stepped into lane 12. At 42, she looked like any other suburban office worker seeking basic firearms training, shoulder-length brown hair pulled into a practical ponytail, wearing a simple navy cardigan over jeans that had seen better days. Her hands, soft from years of pushing papers at the insurance company, trembled slightly as she picked up the rental pistol. To everyone watching, she was exactly what she appeared to be, a nervous, middle-aged woman trying to learn self-defense after a recent break-in at her apartment complex. Detective Marcus Kane noticed her immediately, and not in a good way. Standing 6'3" with the kind of muscular build that came from years of tactical training, Kane commanded respect wherever he went. His steel-gray eyes and permanent scowl had intimidated countless criminals, and right now, they were fixed on Sarah with obvious disapproval. He was at the range with his SWAT team, preparing for tomorrow's high-stakes operation, the rescue of Senator Patricia Coleman, who had been taken hostage by a radical militia group in a downtown office building. The last thing he needed was some soccer mom making rookie mistakes while his team tried to focus. "Excuse me, ma'am." Kane's voice carried the authority of someone unaccustomed to being questioned as he approached Sarah's lane. "This is a professional training facility today. We've got an operation tomorrow that requires our full concentration, and frankly, beginners can be a safety hazard when we're running live fire exercises." His tone suggested this was more of an order than a request. Behind him, 3 members of his elite SWAT unit nodded in agreement, their tactical gear and confident stances making Sarah look even more out of place. Sarah looked up from the pistol she'd been examining, her green eyes meeting Kane's without flinching. "I have a reservation," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the obvious intimidation tactic. "Lane 12. 2 to 4 p.m. I paid in advance." She held up her confirmation receipt, but Kane barely glanced at it. The truth was, Sarah had specifically chosen this time slot after overhearing Kane's team discussing their training schedule at the coffee shop next door. She needed to see how they operated, though she couldn't explain why without revealing secrets she'd buried 10 years ago. Kane's jaw tightened as he realized she wasn't going to be easily intimidated. "Look, lady, I don't know what kind of insurance seminar taught you to handle firearms, but this isn't a game. Tomorrow, real people's lives are on the line, including a United States Senator. My team needs to practice scenarios that require split-second timing and perfect coordination. One stray shot from an amateur could throw off our entire preparation." He gestured toward his team, who were setting up complex obstacle courses and target arrangements that looked nothing like the simple bullseye targets Sarah had been expecting. What Kane didn't know was that Sarah had studied the hostage situation obsessively for the past week. Ever since the news broke, the 15-story Meridian Financial Building where Senator Coleman was being held presented unique tactical challenges that reminded her of operations she'd rather forget. The militia group, calling themselves the Constitutional Guard, had taken over floors 8 through 12, using advanced surveillance equipment and strategic positioning that suggested military training. Traditional SWAT tactics would likely result in casualties both among the hostage takers and potentially Senator Coleman herself. "I understand the gravity of your situation, Detective Kane," Sada replied, carefully placing the pistol on the counter with practiced precision that Kane was too focused on his own authority to notice. "I just need an hour to complete my basic proficiency test. I promise I won't interfere with your training." She knew she was pushing boundaries, but something about the tactical setup Kane's team was practicing troubled her. Their approach was too direct, too aggressive for the specific layout of the Meridian building. She'd studied the architectural plans online, cross-referencing them with news reports and police statements, and she could see fatal flaws in their strategy. Kane's radio crackled to life, Interrupting the standoff, Detective Kane, this is dispatch. We need an immediate status update on tomorrow's operation prep. The senator's family is asking questions, and the FBI is breathing down the commissioner's neck. Kane grabbed the radio, his irritation evident as he keyed the mic. Kane here, we're running final drills now. But we've got a civilian situation that needs resolving first. His emphasis on the word civilian was deliberately condescending, meant to remind everyone within earshot of their relative importance. Sarah used the momentary distraction to observe Kane's team more carefully. Sergeant Torres, the team's sniper, was practicing shots from elevated positions, but his angles were all wrong for the Meridian building's specific architecture. The building's unique design included reinforced concrete pillars and steel beam construction that would make traditional sniper positioning nearly impossible. Officer Williams, their breacher, was focusing on explosive entry techniques that would likely collapse sections of the older building's framework, potentially endangering the hostages they were trying to save. Most concerning was Officer Davis, their tactical coordinator, who seemed to be planning entry routes that failed to account for the militia's reported surveillance capabilities. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," Kane said, ending his radio call and turning back to Sarah with renewed determination. "This is a matter of national security, and I have the authority to clear this facility of non-essential personnel." He stepped closer, using his imposing physical presence to emphasize his point. "I'm sure you can find another time to play with guns. Maybe try a community center or something more appropriate for beginners." His team chuckled at the suggestion, their expensive tactical gear and specialized weapons, making Sarah's simple setup look almost childish by comparison. But Sarah wasn't intimidated. 10 years ago, she had been Captain Sarah Mitchell, one of the most decorated snipers in military history, with a specialty in impossible shots and unconventional tactics that saved lives when traditional approaches failed. She'd earned her reputation through 19 successful hostage rescues and countless covert operations where precision wasn't just important, it was the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The trembling in her hands wasn't nerves. It was muscle memory, fighting against 10 years of suppression. Her body remembering skills she'd tried desperately to forget after the mission that cost her everything. The turning point came when Kane's radio erupted with urgent chatter. All units. We have a developing situation at the Meridian building. The Constitutional Guard has moved Senator Coleman to a different floor and increased their surveillance perimeter. They've also taken 3 additional hostages civilians who were working late in adjacent offices. Repeat. We now have 4 hostages in an unknown location within the building. Kane's face went pale as he absorbed the implications. Their entire tactical plan had been based on the senator being held on the 10th floor, but now everything had changed. Sarah stepped forward, her voice cutting through the chaos of radio chatter and frantic team discussions. "Detective Kane, I know you have no reason to trust me, but I've been following this situation closely, and I think I can help." Her tone had changed subtly, carrying an authority that hadn't been there moments before. The Constitutional Guard isn't just a militia group. They're using military-grade equipment and tactics that suggest professional training. Your current approach is going to get people killed, including your team. The confidence in her voice made Kane pause. Even as his instincts told him to dismiss her concerns, Kane turned to face her fully. His expression, a mixture of incredulity and desperate hope. The additional hostages changed everything, and he knew the FBI would take over the operation within hours if his team couldn't demonstrate a viable rescue plan. "And what exactly do you think you know about tactical operations? Lady, did you watch some movies, read a book?" But even as he spoke the dismissive words, something in Sarah's demeanor made him hesitate. She was standing differently now, her casual civilian posture replaced by something that looked almost military. I know that the Meridian building's construction makes traditional sniper positioning impossible from street level, Sarah said, her voice gaining strength with each word. I know that the steel beam infrastructure will deflect most ballistic entry attempts, and I know that the Constitutional Guard has had 3 days to set up overlapping fields of fire that will turn any direct assault into a slaughter. She paused, letting the implications sink in. But I also know there's another way, a way that uses the building's unique architecture as an advantage instead of an obstacle, a way that could save all 4 hostages, and most of your team. Kane's radio crackled again with increasingly urgent updates. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, with reports of movement within the building suggesting the militia was preparing for a siege. Time was running out, and Kane found himself in the impossible position of needing help from someone he'd dismissed as irrelevant just minutes earlier. "All right," he said finally, his pride warring with his responsibility to the hostages and his team. "You've got 5 minutes to explain what you think you know. But if this is some kind of game or attention-seeking behavior, I'll have you arrested for interfering with a federal operation." Sarah nodded, her transformation from nervous civilian to tactical consultant now complete. The key is Ricochet shooting using the building's steel structure to redirect shots around corners and obstacles. It's an advanced technique that requires precise calculation of angles, velocities, and material densities. But it can put bullets exactly where traditional methods can't reach. She moved to the range's whiteboard, sketching the Meridian building's layout from memory with startling accuracy. "If you can get me into position with the right equipment and clear sight lines to specific structural points, I can neutralize threats without exposing your team to direct fire." Kane stared at the diagram, recognizing details about the building that hadn't been in any of their briefing materials. "How do you know all this?" he demanded. But Sarah was already moving to the equipment rack, selecting a high-powered rifle with the efficiency of someone who had done this countless times before. Her movements were fluid, professional, completely different from the hesitant woman who had struggled with the simple pistol just minutes earlier. "Who are you really?" Kane asked. But deep down, he was already beginning to understand that he had made a terrible mistake in his initial assessment. "Right now, I'm the person who can save Senator Coleman and those civilians," Sarah replied, checking the rifle's action with movements so smooth they looked choreographed. "But if you want the full story, you'll have to wait until after we bring everyone home alive." She looked directly at Kane, and for the first time, he saw something in her eyes that made his breath catch the cold. Calculating gaze of someone who had looked down a scope at human targets and made the hardest decisions in the world. "The question is, Detective Kane, are you ready to trust the woman you just tried to throw out of your training facility with the most important operation of your career?" The Meridian Financial Building rose 15 stories into the gray Seattle sky, its steel and glass facade reflecting the flashing lights of the dozens of emergency vehicles surrounding its base. Detective Kane crouched behind the command vehicle, studying blueprints that seemed inadequate for the complexity of the situation they faced. The Constitutional Guard had transformed the building into a fortress, using their 3-day head start to establish firing positions, surveillance networks, and what appeared to be sophisticated communication systems that allowed them to coordinate movements across multiple floors. Sarah knelt beside him, now wearing tactical gear that Kane had reluctantly provided after witnessing her professional handling of the range equipment. She had spent the last 2 hours studying police surveillance footage, architectural drawings, and intelligence reports with an intensity that impressed even his most experienced team members. Her civilian disguise was completely gone, replaced by the focused demeanor of someone who had faced similar situations before. "The militia has Senator Coleman and the 3 civilians on the 11th floor," she said, pointing to specific locations on the blueprint. "They've positioned armed guards at all traditional entry points and established overlapping fields of fire that cover every direct approach. Kane nodded grimly, his earlier skepticism replaced by grudging respect for Sarah's tactical knowledge. The FBI had indeed taken over primary command of the operation, but they had agreed to let his SWAT team handle the actual rescue attempt after Sarah's briefing revealed critical flaws in their federal counterparts' aggressive approach. Agent Morrison wants to use explosive charges to breach the main stairwell, Kane said, indicating the FBI commander who was setting up his own tactical position nearby, but your analysis suggests that would bring down part of the floor structure. It would do more than that, Sarah replied, tracing the building's steel support system with her finger. The Meridian was built in 1987 using a unique hybrid construction method that combined steel frame with reinforced concrete cores. Explosive breaching at the points Morrison has selected would likely cause cascading structural failure affecting floors 9 through 13. Even if the hostages survived the initial blast, they'd be trapped under tons of debris. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had studied building construction not as an academic exercise, but as a matter of life and death in operational environments. Sergeant Torres, Kane's sniper, leaned over the blueprints with obvious frustration. So what do you propose? We can't get clear sight lines from any external position. And every internal approach is covered by their surveillance network. They've got cameras, motion sensors, and what looks like military-grade communication equipment that lets them coordinate their defensive positions in real time. Torres had 20 years of experience, but he had never faced an adversary this well-prepared or this strategically positioned. Sarah pulled out a tablet showing detailed structural engineering diagrams she had somehow acquired in the past few hours. The building's steel beam construction creates natural ricochet pathways, she explained, highlighting specific angles and trajectories. If we can establish firing positions at these 3 locations, the parking garage access ramp, the 8th floor emergency exit platform, and the rooftop maintenance area, we can use calculated ricochet shots to reach targets that are otherwise impossible to engage. She traced bullet paths that seemed to defy traditional ballistics, bouncing off steel beams and concrete surfaces to reach predetermined destinations. Kane studied the proposed shots with growing amazement and concern. You're talking about bank shots at distances of over 300 yards, through multiple ricochet points. With moving targets and civilian lives at stake, the margin for error is essentially zero. And if you miscalculate even slightly, you could hit the hostages instead of their captors. He looked at Sarah intently, searching her face for any sign of doubt or uncertainty. This isn't a training exercise or a theoretical discussion. Are you absolutely certain you can make these shots? I've made harder ones, Sarah said simply, but Kane caught the shadow that crossed her face when she said it. There was a story there, a history that explained her extraordinary skills and her decade-long retreat from any situation that might require them. But I'll need specific equipment and a team that can follow precise timing protocols. The ricochet technique requires perfect coordination between multiple firing positions and split-second execution. If even one element is off, the entire operation fails. Agent Morrison approached their position in his FBI tactical gear and commanding presence, making it clear he wasn't particularly interested in local input. Detective Kane, I've been monitoring your discussion, and I have to say I'm not comfortable with this ricochet shooting proposal. It's unproven, risky, and completely outside standard federal protocols for hostage rescue operations. Morrison was a by-the-book agent who had built his career on overwhelming force and textbook tactics. The idea of trusting an unknown civilian with an unconventional approach went against every instinct he had developed over 15 years of federal service. Sarah stood to face Morrison directly, her posture straightening into something that Kane was beginning to recognize as her natural military bearing. Agent Morrison, with respect, your standard protocols are going to result in multiple casualties. including the hostages you're trying to save. The Constitutional Guard has had 3 days to study your tactical manual and prepare countermeasures for every conventional approach you might attempt. Her voice was calm but carried an underlying steel that made Morrison step back slightly. They're not common criminals or even typical domestic terrorists. They're using military tactics and equipment that require military-level solutions. Morrison's face reddened with indignation. And you think you're qualified to provide military-level solutions? What's your background? Exactly? Kane mentioned you were some kind of insurance worker who happened to be at the shooting range when this situation developed. His tone suggested he found the entire concept absurd, but there was also a hint of uncertainty in his voice. Something about Sarah's confidence and technical knowledge didn't match her supposed civilian background. My qualifications aren't what's important right now, Sarah replied evenly. What's important is that Senator Coleman and 3 innocent civilians are going to die if we don't adapt our tactics to the realities of this situation. The Constitutional Guard isn't waiting for us to figure out a textbook solution. They're prepared to execute the hostages if they detect any conventional assault attempt. She pointed to surveillance footage showing armed militia members positioned near the hostages. Look at their positioning, their equipment, their communication protocols. These aren't weekend warriors playing soldier. They're using advanced tactical techniques that require an equally advanced response. Kane's radio suddenly erupted with urgent chatter from surveillance teams positioned around the building. Command. This is Overwatch 3. We have movement on the 11th floor. It looks like they're preparing to relocate the hostages again. Repeat. The targets are moving. The implications were immediate and terrifying if the militia moved Senator Coleman and the civilians to a different location. All their planning would become useless, and the FBI would likely resort to an immediate assault that could result in multiple casualties. How long do we have? Kane demanded, keying his radio for a response. The surveillance team's answer chilled everyone listening. Estimate 10 minutes before they complete the relocation. After that, we lose visual contact and have no way to track their position within the building. Morrison grabbed his own radio, clearly preparing to order an immediate assault rather than risk losing the hostages entirely. But Sarah stepped forward with quiet urgency. Give me 5 minutes to get into position, she said, already moving toward the equipment van. I can make the shots from the parking garage ramp if someone can provide spotting and communication support. But we have to move now, before they relocate the hostages to a position where ricochet shots won't be possible. Her transformation was complete. Now the nervous civilian was gone, replaced by someone who moved with deadly purpose and spoke with the authority of experience in situations exactly like this one. Morrison hesitated, caught between his training and the reality that conventional tactics weren't going to work in this situation. Kane made the decision for him. Torres, Williams, you're with her for support and communication. Davis, coordinate with the surveillance teams to track target movements and provide real-time updates. He looked directly at Sarah as his team mobilized around her. You've got your chance to prove this ricochet theory actually works. But understand that if this goes wrong, if those hostages get hurt because I trusted an unknown quantity over established protocols, it's on both of us. Sarah nodded, checking her equipment one final time before heading toward the parking garage. Detective Kane, there's something you should know before we do this. My name isn't really Sarah Mitchell, and I wasn't just some insurance worker who happened to be at your range today. She paused at the command vehicle's door, looking back at Kane with an expression that mixed regret with determination. 10 years ago, I was Captain Sarah Henderson, and I spent 8 years as a military sniper specializing in impossible shots and unconventional tactics. I retired after a mission went wrong and cost me everything I cared about. I've been hiding from situations like this ever since. But Senator Coleman doesn't deserve to die because of my past mistakes. Kane stared at her in shock, pieces suddenly falling into place. Her knowledge of the building's construction, her professional handling of weapons, her confidence in proposing tactics that seemed impossible to civilian eyes. "Why didn't you tell us this from the beginning?" he demanded. But Sarah was already moving toward the parking garage, Torres and Williams flanking her with professional efficiency that suggested they had accepted her leadership despite their initial skepticism. "Because I hoped I'd never have to be that person again," Sarah called back over her shoulder. "But sometimes the past catches up with you, and you have to choose between who you were and who you need to be." She disappeared into the parking garage, leaving Kane to coordinate with Morrison and the FBI team while wrestling with the realization that he had nearly dismissed the one person who might be able to save the hostages' lives. The parking garage's concrete structure provided perfect cover as Sarah positioned herself at the calculated angle that would allow her ricochet shots to reach the 11th floor. Torres set up his spotting scope, while Williams established communication links with the surveillance teams tracking the militia's movements. Through her rifle scope, Sarah could see the steel beam structure that would serve as her ricochet points, each one precisely positioned to redirect her bullets toward targets that couldn't be engaged through direct fire. Overwatch to Sarah. Torres's voice came through her earpiece. "We have visual confirmation of all 4 hostages on the 11th floor. Northeastern corner office. 3 armed subjects maintaining perimeter guard. 2 additional subjects handling what appears to be communication equipment." The intelligence was crucial. Sarah needed to know not just where her targets were, but how they were positioned relative to the hostages and each other. Sarah adjusted her rifle position, calculating wind speed, distance, and the complex ballistics required for successful ricochet shots. Each bullet would need to strike specific points on the building's steel structure at precise angles, maintaining enough velocity after the ricochet to neutralize threats while avoiding any possibility of hitting the innocent civilians. It was the kind of shooting that existed at the very edge of human capability, requiring not just exceptional marksmanship, but an almost intuitive understanding of physics and materials science. "Command, this is Sarah." She radioed to Kane's position. "I have clear sight lines to all required ricochet points. Targets are positioned as expected, and hostages appear unharmed but are being moved toward the eastern wall of the floor. Recommend immediate execution before they complete the relocation." Her voice was calm and professional, showing none of the emotional turmoil that came from returning to a role she had tried to leave behind forever. Kane's response was immediate. "You are cleared hot. Sarah, all surveillance teams report ready. Emergency medical is standing by, and Morrison has agreed to hold federal assault teams until your attempt is complete." There was a pause. Then Kane's voice returned with obvious emotion. "Sarah, I owe you an apology for how I treated you earlier. Bring them home safe, and we'll sort out everything else later." Sarah smiled grimly as she settled into her final firing position, her breathing slowing to the controlled rhythm that had once made her legendary in military circles, where precision meant everything. "Torres, give me range and wind compensation for Ricochet Point Alpha," she requested, beginning the sequence that would either save 4 lives or haunt her for the rest of her own. The parking garage fell silent, except for the distant sounds of police activity and the quiet click of her rifle's safety being disengaged. Through her scope, Sarah could see the first ricochet point, clearly a steel beam junction, exactly 247 yards away, that would redirect her bullet toward the militia guard positioned nearest to Senator Coleman. The physics were complex but not impossible. A .308 caliber round fired at the calculated angle would strike the steel beam at precisely the right point to send it toward the target at sufficient velocity to neutralize the threat while minimizing risk to nearby civilians. "Wind is steady at 4 miles per hour from the southwest," Torres reported through her earpiece. "Distance to primary ricochet point confirmed at 247 yards. Angle of approach optimal for intended trajectory." His professional calm helped anchor Sarah in the present moment, preventing her mind from drifting to similar situations where the stakes had been just as high but the outcomes tragically different. Sarah's finger found the trigger as she made final adjustments to her aim point. 10 years of civilian life had dulled some of her skills, but the fundamental knowledge remained: the understanding of how bullets behaved when they encountered different materials, how velocity and angle combined to create predictable ricochet patterns, how to calculate the complex mathematics that turned impossible shots into life-saving precision. Engaging target 1 and 3. 2. 1. The rifle's report echoed through the parking garage as Sarah's first bullet struck the steel beam exactly where she had intended. The ricochet was perfect, sending the round on a new trajectory that carried it through a window and into the chest of the militia guard who had been holding a gun to Senator Coleman's head. The guard dropped instantly, his weapon clattering harmlessly to the floor as the other militia members spun around in confusion, unable to identify where the shot had come from. Target 1 neutralized. Torres confirmed through his spotting scope. Hostages appear unharmed. Remaining subjects are seeking cover, but maintaining positions near civilians. Sarah was already adjusting her aim for the second shot, this one requiring an even more complex ricochet pattern that would send her bullet around a concrete pillar to reach a guard positioned behind partial cover. The second shot followed within 15 seconds, striking another carefully calculated ricochet point and eliminating the militia member who had been coordinating communications for the group. With their leadership disrupted and 2 of their number down, the remaining guards began to panic, making the tactical error of moving away from the hostages in an attempt to find better defensive positions. "This is Surveillance Team Alpha," came an urgent radio transmission. "Remaining subjects are moving away from hostages. Repeat, hostages are no longer being directly threatened. Recommend immediate entry by assault teams to secure the floor." Morrison's FBI tactical units were already moving, rappelling from the roof and ascending through stairwells that had become accessible once the militia's defensive coordination collapsed. Sarah maintained her position, tracking the remaining militia members through her scope in case additional ricochet shots became necessary. But Kane's SWAT team and Morrison's FBI agents moved with professional efficiency, securing the hostages and capturing the surviving Constitutional Guard members within minutes. Senator Coleman emerged from the building physically unharmed, though clearly shaken by her ordeal. All hostages secured, all subjects neutralized or in custody. Kane's voice came through Sarah's earpiece with obvious relief. "Outstanding work, Sarah. Your ricochet shots made the difference between a successful rescue and a potential massacre." There was genuine admiration in his voice, mixed with an understanding that he had witnessed something extraordinary, a demonstration of skills that existed at the very highest levels of military and law enforcement capability. As Sarah secured her rifle and prepared to leave the parking garage, she found herself surrounded by SWAT team members and FBI agents who wanted to understand how she had made shots that most professional snipers would have considered impossible. But she deflected their questions, focusing instead on ensuring that all equipment was properly secured and that her presence at the scene would be minimized in any official reports. Kane approached her as she finished gathering her gear, his expression mixing gratitude with obvious curiosity about her true background. "Sarah, or Captain Henderson, or whoever you really are," he said, "I need to know how someone with your skills ended up working insurance and hiding at a suburban shooting range. The shots you made today weren't just professional-level marksmanship, they were beyond anything I've seen in 20 years of law enforcement." Sarah looked at the Meridian building, where emergency responders were still processing the scene and debriefing the rescued hostages. "Some skills come with a price. Detective Kane, I spent 8 years as a military sniper, and I was very good at what I did, but the last mission I was assigned to went wrong in ways that made me realize I couldn't continue being that person." She picked up her equipment bag, her expression distant as she remembered events she had tried to forget. "I lost my husband on that final Operation Friendly Fire, caused by miscommunication and tactical errors that I should have anticipated. I retired immediately and spent the last 10 years trying to build a life where precision and split-second decisions didn't determine whether people lived or died." Kane nodded with understanding, recognizing the weight of survivor's guilt that many combat veterans carried. "But you came back when it mattered," he pointed out. "You could have walked away from our confrontation at the range, gone home, and pretended you never heard about Senator Coleman or the Constitutional Guard. Instead, you risked everything to save people you'd never met. Using skills you've been trying to forget, sometimes the past doesn't give you a choice," Sarah replied, adjusting the strap of her equipment bag as she prepared to leave the scene. "I saw your tactical setup at the range, and I knew that conventional approaches weren't going to work against an enemy that well-prepared and strategically positioned. Senator Coleman and those civilians didn't deserve to die because I was too comfortable hiding from who I used to be." As they walked toward the command vehicles, Kane wrestled with questions about Sarah's future and whether she might consider returning to tactical work in some capacity. The FBI and several other federal agencies would undoubtedly be interested in someone with her unique skills and proven ability to solve complex tactical problems, but he could see in her demeanor that Sarah was already retreating back into the civilian identity she had carefully constructed, eager to return to a life where her exceptional abilities remained hidden. "What happens now?" Kane asked, as they reached the edge of the police perimeter. "Do you go back to your insurance job and pretend this never happened? Because I have to tell you, after what I witnessed today, the idea of that level of talent being wasted on actuarial tables seems almost criminal." His tone was respectful, but carried genuine concern that Sarah was making a mistake by continuing to hide her capabilities. Sarah paused at her civilian vehicle, looking back at the Meridian building one final time. "I don't know, Detective Kane. For 10 years, I've been Sarah Mitchell, and that person has found a kind of peace that Captain Henderson never had. But today reminded me that there are situations where those old skills matter, where being able to make impossible shots means the difference between innocent people living or dying." She opened her car door, then turned back to Kane with a slight smile. "Maybe the answer isn't choosing between who I was and who I've become. Maybe it's finding a way to be both." Kane watched her drive away, knowing that he had witnessed something extraordinary, not just the tactical skills that had saved 4 lives, but the internal struggle of someone trying to balance extraordinary capabilities with the desire for an ordinary life. He made a mental note to ensure that Sarah's role in the rescue remained as confidential as possible, understanding that unwanted attention could destroy the careful anonymity she had built over the past decade. But Kane also knew that word of the Ricochet shots would spread through law enforcement and military circles, creating legends that would grow with each retelling. Somewhere in classified files and unofficial stories, the tale of the civilian who appeared from nowhere to make impossible shots and save Senator Coleman would become part of the mythology that surrounded elite tactical operations, and perhaps someday, when another impossible situation arose, Sarah Henderson would choose to step forward again, ready to prove that true skill never really disappears, it just waits for the moment when it's needed most. 3 months after the Meridian building rescue, Sarah Mitchell returned to her routine at Pinnacle Insurance, processing claims and conducting risk assessments with the same methodical precision that had once made her a legendary sniper. Her colleagues noticed that she seemed more confident somehow, carrying herself with a subtle authority that hadn't been there before. But none of them connected their quiet coworker with the classified reports circulating through federal law enforcement about an unknown civilian who had saved Senator Coleman with impossible ricochet shots. Detective Kane had kept his word about protecting Sarah's anonymity, ensuring that official reports described the rescue as a successful SWAT operation without mentioning the unconventional tactics that had made it possible. But within elite tactical circles, whispered, stories spread about a mystery shooter who could make bullets dance around corners and strike targets that couldn't be reached through direct fire. Training programs began incorporating Ricochet shooting techniques. Though few instructors possessed the mathematical understanding and ballistic expertise necessary to teach the advanced calculations Sarah had mastered through years of combat experience, on a quiet Thursday afternoon, as Sarah reviewed flood damage claims from the previous month's storms, her secure phone rang for the second time since her retirement from active duty. The first call had brought her back into a world she thought she'd left behind. This second call would force her to decide whether that return had been a one-time exception or the beginning of a new chapter in her carefully controlled life. "The mockingbird still sings at midnight," came the familiar voice of Colonel Marcus Winters, her former handler, and one of only 3 people who knew the full truth about her decade of civilian disguise. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she recognized the code phrase that indicated an emergency requiring her specific skills. After the Meridian rescue, she had hoped that demonstration of her continued capabilities would satisfy whatever obligations remained from her military service. But apparently, the world had other plans. "I thought we agreed that Captain Henderson was permanently retired," Sarah said quietly, glancing around her office to ensure none of her coworkers were within hearing distance. Her insurance company cubicle suddenly felt impossibly small and mundane compared to the life-and-death situations that Winter's calls typically involved. The Seattle situation was supposed to be the exception that proved the Rulawan final mission to close the book on that part of my life. Winter's voice carried the weight of someone delivering news he wished he didn't have to share. "I'm afraid circumstances have developed that require your unique combination of skills and plausible deniability. We have a situation involving international hostages, a terrorist cell with advanced tactical training, and a deadline that makes conventional rescue operations impossible." He paused, allowing the implications to sink in. "Sarah, they're using Ricochet defensive positions specifically designed to counter traditional sniper tactics. Intelligence suggests they studied reports of the Meridian rescue and adapted their strategy accordingly." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a tactical vest she had hoped never to wear again. "Where and when?" she asked, surprised by how quickly her mind shifted from insurance protocols to operational planning. The civilian life she had built felt suddenly fragile, like a house of cards that could be scattered by the wind of necessity and duty that seemed to follow her despite her best efforts to escape it. "I'll send coordinates and a full briefing packet to your secure email," Winters replied. "But Sarah, this time it's not just about saving lives, it's about preventing an international incident that could destabilize an entire region. The hostages include diplomats from 3 allied nations, and the terrorist cell has threatened to execute them unless their demands are met. Demands that our government simply cannot fulfill without compromising ongoing operations that protect thousands of other lives." As Sarah hung up the phone and stared at her computer screen displaying routine insurance claims, she realized that her brief return to the world of impossible shots and life-or-death decisions had changed her more than she wanted to admit. The satisfaction she had once found in the predictable world of actuarial calculations now felt hollow compared to the immediate, tangible impact of using her skills to save innocent lives. Perhaps Detective Kane had been right when he suggested that hiding her capabilities was a waste of talent that could make a real difference in the world. The secure email arrived within minutes, containing satellite photos, tactical assessments, and intelligence reports that painted a picture of complexity that would challenge even her extraordinary abilities. But as Sarah studied the information, she found herself calculating angles and trajectories instead of dwelling on the personal cost of returning to operational status. The woman who had once been Captain Sarah Henderson was still there beneath the surface, waiting for moments when only impossible shots could save the day. Sarah closed her insurance files, gathered her personal belongings, and walked toward her supervisor's office to request an indefinite leave of absence for family emergency. As she composed the words that would temporarily end her civilian life, she wondered if this pattern would continue quiet. Years of normal existence, interrupted by crises that required skills possessed by perhaps a dozen people in the entire world. Perhaps this was simply who she was destined to be, a guardian angel who appeared when conventional heroes weren't enough, making impossible shots and disappearing back into anonymity before anyone could ask too many questions about how miracles actually worked. But as Sarah prepared to once again become Captain Henderson, she carried with her the knowledge that her abilities could serve something greater than military objectives or national interests. They could serve justice, protection of the innocent, and the simple but profound principle that those with extraordinary capabilities bore responsibility for using them when others' lives hung in the balance. The ricochet that had saved Senator Coleman had ricocheted through her own life as well, redirecting her path toward a future where hiding was no longer an option, and where impossible shots would always find their mark when they mattered most.